And we're back with another episode of Lean by Design. Lawrence, thanks for joining us today. I am excited to have this conversation today with you. I think we are going to be talking about something that many of us, many of our listeners have probably dealt with before. Have you ever worked or been involved at an organization where everyone sort of has their own way to do things, where there may be some SOPs that don't necessarily have follow through? Maybe they're expired. Maybe they've never been introduced to the new people that come into the organization. But what we end up finding ourselves are a number of people that know that work is getting done, but no one actually agrees on how it's supposed to flow, who is supposed to be involved, when things are supposed to be delivered. And that just creates friction upon friction upon friction. It removes the ability to have any level of consistency in those deliverables. And as we know through, you name it, working day to day through athletics, consistency is what's going to drive growth. Consistency is what's going to drive improvement in how you operate. So Lawrence, I mean, this is a topic I think that a lot of us are going to really connect with, especially when we join a new organization and we find out that there are no type of procedures written out, explained, no procedures in how to perform the duties. Have you been through that before?
I'm pretty sure everybody deals with this. I think the other side of it is we sometimes have procedures that detail a little too much, and then it becomes something that's so hard to follow that people just create their own way of doing something. Just because it's written there doesn't actually reflect the reality of how people work. And this applies to many different things, because sometimes either the SOP or whatever work instruction you're following isn't reflective of how things have been operating to date. Sometimes there's a lag between updates, right? It's not just I edit a Word document and magically it appears to be this new way of working. And I think, and this is like just a complaint about the training is handled in general in our industry, is we have this thing called the read and understand, which is like not
I've seen
really
those. I've done
something
those.
that makes a whole lot of sense, because I think a lot of people work way better when you actually show them how it works, and these updates and things that we do to our processes should reflect how the majority of people are navigating that system, right? So, to your point, I think that the problem isn't that people don't follow the process, it's just the process doesn't describe how work actually happens.
And sometimes that's a factor of who is actually writing the process or when it was written. Version control is important, and putting when these things were updated is also critically important. And I can empathize with the groups that feel that things are moving so fast. Things are moving at lightning speed. So what ends up happening is that you end up losing ownership of these processes that, now this person's changing their duties. Now they're on another initiative. They're on a project or two, and these things become nice to have. I do want to make one point of clarification, because I think this is something that comes a lot when I'm working with my clients, is SOPs versus another type of document. And what we're explaining here, what we're discussing here is SOPs are those standards. These are standard operating procedures and how you are performing your work and what is required of it. That is a little bit different from a work instruction that allows a little bit of flexibility. And what I tell people is that if you find yourself having a process that you know is a little bit fluid while you guys are trying to find out what your internal standards need to be, then it's okay to create something and develop a work instruction where there might be some modifications depending on what space your project is in, perhaps an indication, perhaps a phase of development. You're not going to have those more mature documentations or processes early in a project. Those are usually after a couple of years of working as a team. So I just wanted to point out that difference. And this is one of those feelings that, one of those things that might be hard to see. So let's talk about what's happening. You're at your organization, you're working, people seem busy. Work is happening. You see people going back and forth, going in and out of meetings. There's conversations that are happening. This is our understanding of work. But how we actually get there and how you button up the end of what these workflows are, that's the question here. You pointed out SOPs not reflecting reality. Sometimes teams describe a process differently. Workarounds start to become normalized. And this is a thing where I found this a lot in the project management space because there's a lot of ownership and accountability when you become a project manager and everything is pointing to you. And when you find that the systems that should be reporting you on the status of your project are broken, you start to create your own workaround. And as your portfolio begins to grow from 3 to 5 to 10 to 15 projects and programs, that flexibility needs to start to have a structure to it so that other projects that come on board now have a level of scaffolding. They have a scaffold that they can actually follow. There might be some nuances, but what we end up seeing is, this project is working better than that project. And it's always pointed to the people. And I have to say that is part of it, the team chemistry, how well, they communicate. But a major part of it is how these teams are creating their internal workflows. And in some cases, they are just being designed by whoever is on that project team, developing these workarounds that are preventing the consistency that is demanded when you're scaling or working in large operations. And then, these sort of Band-Aid improvements don't always work out because now we're creating Band-Aid improvements to a workflow that has workarounds that we've built into it. So patchwork, patchwork, patchwork. So everybody seems busy. We're all working together, but I would say it's probably really not as efficient as we can make it.
Yeah, I mean, do you think so this idea about the people developing workarounds and why do you think people find it easier to build a workaround than to point out that, hey, this doesn't make any sense, maybe we should update something so that everybody is doing the same thing? I think to what your earlier point about process ownership, there's it's sometimes when you come into a new company, you're not clear who actually owns the specific process, and so you come into these situations, and I'll use an example of let's say you do become you're a PM on a project, and you're being asked to develop a timeline for a specific type of change or initiative, right? And so as you're developing the timeline, obviously different types of changes require different timeline structures, right? So there's different things that would have to happen. And so oftentimes, it's maybe not something that's written in like an SOP, but more something like a work instruction that kind of tells you, okay, as you're developing this sort of timeline, these are the constraints that you should think about. These are the people or a guidance of some kind, right? But in probably 80% or even more of a lot of these situations, it's like, all right, just go and draft a timeline and bring it back. And then everybody goes, this looks completely different than the same exact type of project I've worked on before, right? And there's this difference between, like you said, when you're trying to manage multiple projects at the same time, and then they all timelines look all different. You can't gather data on each thing because you're not comparing apples to apples anymore. They're all different shapes and sizes, and it makes resource management incredibly difficult. It makes anybody coming in and out of projects incredibly difficult. It's just these workarounds. I think people are incredibly creative when it comes to these workarounds, but I'm just it's surprising that more people don't really step back and maybe question the system itself and improve it that way. They just go, this is my lane and I got this thing to do and I'm just going to focus on my own project.
Yeah, that's there. I mean, I think there's a couple of pieces that we have to think about too, is that depending on who the person is, they may have some internal cynicism to, if I go bring this up to somebody, they're just going to look at me and say, yeah, why don't you just focus on executing this? Even if this update in process, this update in, instructions is to benefit the pace or the consistency of doing something right. They're often, people are often met with like, this is not a priority. Well, the process itself is a priority to accomplish an end goal of some kind. So how do we get past ignoring when the instructions we're giving to people are completely incorrect or outdated? So what happens? No one has the owner. Okay, who's the owner? Well, let me go reach out to this function. Let me go reach out to finance. Well, they're busy. They're not going to address this. Why? Because this is not their concern right now. This happens to be your concern right now. So this is sort of that cynicism with this, like, I'm going to have to like go in circles to find somebody to do this, or they're going to just make me lead the charge. I'm too busy. What's the fastest thing? I'm just going to make my project work the way I want it to work so that I can work efficiently. I. This is what ends up happening. This is one of the reasons why you find such a difference in capabilities in project teams and program teams, where you have sort of these siloed initiatives that are only happening within an internal team. Instead of addressing these types of challenges head on as a group, you're having them challenged like by a project leader that is just trying to, develop the presentation, trying to create context for what the data looks like for the leadership presentation. It doesn't surprise me, but when you think about how often that happens at an organization, you are just compounding these individual heroics, one on top of the other, on top of the other, probably leaning on the same people. And then you find this unequal distribution, unequal success rate. You find a few more, perhaps, project leads that are more successful than others. Oh, well, they have these views. Well, how do you do that view? Well, I open up an Excel spreadsheet. I click this. I go here. I move this into this system. Then I process it this way. They start to create these big, arduous workflows that are not really utilizing systems that they have available. It's more of, how do I understand what I know, in terms of the systems that I have access to? I'm going to create a Band-Aid for this because I don't want to deal with it anymore. And that's what ends up happening. And so when we look at what is the risk here, well, I think pretty directly, you're going to find a misalignment behind the documented processes and the actual workflows. So how are you going to train somebody? How are you going to train somebody to read these documents and then they go to their team and they say, yeah, I saw this and I read this. And the teammate that's been there for 2 years will say, yeah, that's all. We don't really do that. This is what we do. That is now becoming tribal knowledge, something that needs to diminish as organizations grow in complexity, whether it's scale, size, approach, whatever the case is. You want to make sure that the people that you are bringing on board have the same level of role-based training. Otherwise, you're going to have 10 people in the same role and they're all doing things completely different. And this happens all the time. When you get to leadership, they all have a presentation. So everything's okay. But to your point, well, this project is looking 2 quarters in the back, 4 in the future. This project is looking at 6 years in the future. This one pulls in 3 years in the past. And what we have to recognize is that when we are showing people data, charts, elements of our work, and we are changing their resolution from project to project, it makes it incredibly difficult to understand where your risks are. Are we at risk to meet certain things? Well, I looked at one timeline and it was across 3 years. I looked at the next one, it was 8 years. I looked at the one after that and it was 5 years. So now my brain keeps trying to analyze, like, okay, what's the difference here? What's the difference here? As opposed to having similarities, having those standards so that you can look at the data for the data and not be distracted by appearances, by the resolution.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, and having some sort of not even retroactively, like looking at the how things have progressed over time. But, for somebody that is coming new to a project or an organization to, you know, I think having some mechanism to ask them, like, does this make sense to you? And if it doesn't make sense to a new person walking in, it probably doesn't make sense to some people that are already there at the organization for an extended amount of time, right? And so, how do you think about as these teams or companies go about finding out which workflows are misaligned and to focus on, right? Because it can be, there's different levels of workflows having certain impact to the overall output of groups. And sometimes it's, maybe you have a group that's really good at a certain point in the workflow, but then the handoffs are really broken. And so it's not really, it's like the group does an excellent job in delivering the information that's needed, but then the information just sits there for an extended amount of time because some other team didn't know that it existed, right? And so there's like these workflow boundaries that you'd also have to consider. But it is it's not necessarily easy to pinpoint, especially if some of those processes are not or they haven't been formalized, right? It's just, oh yeah, so and so gives me this thing, and then I give it to this thing. But what is the start and end of that particular process or workflow, right? So you kind of have to like segment these things and then prioritize them. So, from an operational workflow alignment point of view, what are some of those considerations that you would perhaps look at in evaluating a situation like this?
So usually there's some warning signals, and a lot of times, believe it or not, leadership will call out a lot of these things when they look at portfolio level views. Hey, why am I noticing this in these projects, but I don't see that over here? Why are these milestones listed like this, but on these projects the milestones are listed like that? And so these are sort of the things that jump out to us most. Now, in order for you to identify where in the workflows are these particular problems happening, because if you think about any kind of portfolio, it within biopharma, you're going to have very early stage ones that have, very lofty goals in their timelines. You're going to have some that are more mature that say, hey, we have 18 months before we're submitting an IND or an NDA or something like that. And so understanding approximately where in the process, where in that drug development process that these issues are arising is going to be sort of that first look, that first sort of gut instinct of let's go look over here. And then you have to start understanding, how are you forming your teams? What kind of transparency do you have in the shared workflows? Because these are cross-functional teams. None of these teams are working in isolation. They require everybody to be a part of the team for the assets that you're developing, the R&D that you're doing to test it. Any of these safety signals you have to check, even early on, aims testing, and then you're managing that project with a budget, with vendors. There's partnerships. These are very complex projects that require a lot of coordination, and it starts internally. If you show this outward facing into partners, they're going to start to scratch their heads and say, did we partner with the right people? So we tend to forget that how your operations are internally very much affects how your relationships are with your partners, and vice versa. You want to make sure that you can trust that when we have these things scheduled out, that people are going to actually, take them on and do them. I think that there's process ownership when we have sort of attrition, we have people changing roles, we have people changing internally and new people coming in, really making sure that there is a process owner and there is a solid description that is understood by all of what it means to own a process, of maintaining that process, of being an ambassador to that process. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I don't know how to do X, it is not your job to sit there and tell them this is how you do it. You can go grab the link, grab the document and say, this is your document. This will tell you what to do. Come back to me if you have questions. This is something that's really, we don't want to take that extra step to show somebody how to fish. We just tell them really quickly because, it's a quick thing. I don't mind. It's not that you don't mind. It's that you are not doing any favors to that person that's actually trying to find what is the workflow that we're supposed to be doing. I had these challenges even working in the lab. There are so many ways to do basic science, and depends if it came from this book or if it came from that book. And there's some subtleties. So even doing something as simple as a transfection, where you have a small piece of DNA, you're trying to get it into a transfectable cell, like a T, for example. This is just a cell that is commonly used to sort of create, versions of other disease state cells. So we're going to use this one. We're going to inject it with this piece of DNA. It's going to spit out this ligand on its membrane, and then we can do some experiments. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can do electroporation. You can use some transfection models that is more of like an incubation, that over time it uses a viral vector to go in, deposit the DNA, and then come back out. And then now you have your model system. Now you have a model system that you can work with safely. Well, there's multiple ways to do that. And when I came into one organization, when I was still working in the lab, they said, yeah, just do a transfection. I said, okay, how do you guys do it here? Just do one. So that was, to me, sort of like okay, well, now I have to decide which way that I'm going to do this. And my results may confirm or negate whatever they had, just because I did something differently than how they did before. And this is what, these are creating structural inefficiencies completely by the effort of the person that's trying to just get work done, right? They're trying to get work to happen. And this is, again, what we talk about, where we're mistaking being busy with being productive. Being productive is not creating 17 workarounds to get your job done every day. Being productive is finding the best optimal route to perform the duties that you need to produce the work that is your role, that your role provides. And I think sometimes we forget about that. And it's super critical, because we often mistake, and it's, let me ask you this. When was the last time you heard, I'm so busy, I can't do X? Was that recent? Last time you heard that from somebody? I didn't have a chance to. I wasn't able to. I never had a chance to reflect on this. I did not have a chance to look at the document you sent that was requested. I didn't have a chance to look at the action items. I didn't have a chance to look at the decisions.
I didn't even know you did it.
I didn't even know you did it. Right. I mean, these are things that you're doing a lot of things, but it does not mean that you're aligned to the people in the organization. And to really create an operational workflow is to create a rhythm for your business that is just breathing with a consistent rhythm of activities, recording, reporting, and continuing on in the process. But it's so critical and important to ground all of these things in reality. If you make a change, it's not just making a change and creating an SOP. It's making a change and saying, what do we need to hold as standards? For example, something as simple as like your timeline should be 3 quarters in the back, 5 quarters going forward. So we know a little bit of the history. That is a standard. A work instruction is where you're going to say, okay, I want you to go in here, verify the numbers. You're going to export this and drop it into here and update the colors for leadership. Because a lot of times we don't recognize how damaging it is when we present things that are not consistent, especially to leaders that unfortunately probably did not do the recommended homework of reviewing the slide deck before the presentation. And the first thing that their eyes are going to force their brain to think about is, why does this look so different than the last one? What am I looking at now? They have to reorient themselves. And what you want to be able to do is develop the consistency of what we're looking at, of how you're doing your work, so that you can compare apples to apples. You can identify where are the risks happening. When people want you to identify risks and understand what the major problems are, if you're looking at, elements, like let's just say slides, for example, that are all different, the first risk I would point out is that everything is different. There is no alignment. There is no consistency in how we are representing any of these programs. And that slows down progress. time and time again, and is not a sign of alignment by any stretch.
Yeah, and I was gonna come from the other angle of, if again, to your example of the slides, and as we all go to these meetings, and sometimes it's called a steering committee, but other times it's called something else. But essentially, there's a bunch of people in leadership, and you have these very condensed slides with very specific metrics. And well, first of all, hopefully everybody agrees that those are the numbers that we actually care about, because now it trickles down to, like, how do we get that number in the first place, right? And then you think about all the effort that goes into people updating things, and moving it all the way up the chain till it gets to that final slide deck. And the workflow and the process that you talk about, it's really the entire thing, from the moment that somebody is, maybe, say, performing something out in the field or on the floor in the lab, wherever it is. Every activity kind of feeds into something that is being rolled up further and further up, to ultimately it is that number that they care about, because those numbers help them give context to the decision that they're about to make next, that influences everybody underneath, right? And so I think these workarounds, the risk in doing that is you don't have consistency in how people are gathering the necessary information to go back up top.
Mm-hmm.
And so different projects report out different things, or maybe certain person does like 6 of the required activities and another person does 2. It just, there's so much inconsistency with how the information is being collected. And um, I think it's very important to, yes, question why it is that we're collecting the particular metric or whatever it is. But it's also really important to ask the other people, like, is it how much of a pain it is for you to get this information in the first place, right? It might be something that you have to log into like 10 different systems, and you're updating one thing after the other. And then you go, okay, well, what can we do to make that less painful for you, so that you spend less time updating slides and more time doing work? Just the simple things like that, that just make sure that not only you're aligned with the intent of that particular workflow, because hopefully these workflows are developed in a way that it's for a specific decision being made, right? It's not like you're, for the sake of, I'm going to pick up this rock and move it over here. There's got to be some point to that, right?
It's usually not exploratory, not in the system. When you're working in academia, right, there might be like an end goal to understand something, but typically once you're already in an organization that has a couple of assets, you are trying to directly build something, create something that can be licensed, that can be sold, that can be internally developed through the clinic into their first product, which is a very different approach than in academia, that you're looking to discover sort of the relationships in these living systems that are not quite elucidated. And I think you're pointing out things that muddy the perspective of we're in trouble. They don't actually show where the issues are. And so trying to recognize what the signals are so that you can recognize that there's a problem. Well, why is there a problem? We're getting work done. But I'm reminded of conversations that I've had where, cynically you say, "Oh, so what do you do for work?" "I get paid a lot of money to do something stupid. I get paid a lot of money to make slides. I get paid a lot of money to, write reports." Let's think about that for a minute. Actually, the salaries that we have that are a factor of the education, of the technical knowledge, of our skill sets. And yet, when we end up in these organizations, our first target is, how much can I do? And not what impact can my work have? So we find ourselves taking on these challenges of workarounds and building workarounds and not communicating. These are lessons learned. They don't have to come from a project. What's my lesson? The SOP is wrong. What did I learn? Steps 5 through 10 don't actually exist anymore. So here's what we're doing. Here's how we've mitigated this. And I'm telling you guys now so that you guys have an approach that is structured to what we're trying to deliver as a group to leadership, respective to the project or respective to our research that we're doing. And that's important to pause and take a look at and say, okay, well, why is that happening? Why is it that you're getting paid so much to do slide presentations? It probably has something to do because you're spending so much time on these workarounds. You don't have a consistent structure to follow to deliver that consistency at the end of the day. Operational workflow alignment is as much about creating connections to your neighboring functions and departments as it is how you are delivering your work product. And this depends whether you're in manufacturing in the facilities, if you're a scientist, if you're in HR, if you're a project manager, if you're a leader, middle manager, you have some type of work product. The success of some of these projects is probably what everybody is looking at, but you have specific deliverables, whether or not they're explicitly written, in order to make those things a reality.
Yeah, as you're saying that, it made me think about some, the overlap between your process lifecycle and a product lifecycle, right? So I think everybody knows every now and then you'll get a little thing that pops up in your computer that says, "Oh, I got to update this thing and then restart because I have to fix
All the
some
time.
bugs," or right. And so that same concept of, somebody in the background is maybe collecting information about how the computer is performing or whatever the program is. And then they're recognizing, wow, a lot of people are getting stuck in this one step. And then they're issuing out a patch to fix the issue so that you don't have to go through that again. I think as these workflows and processes, I don't think it comes natural for us to go, yeah, this thing is really difficult and cumbersome for me to work through. Let me just put in a ticket so that everybody else knows. The automatic thing is, oh yeah, let me just work around this thing by building something else.
And we should
right?
we should want to do that. Why don't we do that? Why don't we? It's the most bizarre thing to me where we look at an issue and instead of saying, how do I create a fix and communicate that, or how do I get the right people on board, we just turn to, well, I got to get my work done. And so I'm just going to make this happen. Now, granted, every once in a while, you have to create a workflow because there's this new request that came in. Our system's not built for that. But I mean, are you working for yourself or do you have other people on your team? If you don't care, you probably shouldn't be a part of that organization or that team.
Yeah, and look, I get it. You made a point about the lessons learned, and I think in working with other companies and projects, usually the thing with lessons learned is that if I have a formal request to change a certain process and I submit it, who is supposed to do that, right?
Where does that
Where
go?
does it
Where
go
does that
to,
go?
right?
Yeah.
We put in a request to change something, and then it just piles up into this giant. It's like a little, like a box that you put suggestions in.
It's like a ballot box. Yeah. A suggestion
And then,
box.
well, then the question is, okay, well, who opens that suggestion box? And then how do we prioritize all the
Who
things that are
prioritizes
suggested
it?
here?
Yeah.
Who takes ownership of it? And I think that's where, we're coming back to this whole idea of process ownership, right? Part of your job as a process owner is not just being the steward of the process from start to finish, but it's also to iterate on it and to take in these improvements and actually prioritize what things need to get fixed and improved, or maybe there are things that you shouldn't, right? I'm not saying everything needs to get fixed because we only have a finite amount of time, money, and resources. So you really have to focus on the things that are giving people the most pain
Value. Yes.
value, right?
Yes.
So doing
I mean,
that with the
that's
most
a
risk
huge
is
point there.
there's certain things that you would consider criteria.
That's a huge point there where you're going to get a lot of noise out of this. Hey, I don't like that this does this. I don't like when you see something that says, I don't like X, that's a personal preference. When you hear that something is preventing the further part of the workflow, or if we did X, it avoids these last couple of steps. These are suggestions that should definitely be taken into consideration when you're looking at that workflow. And as you said, as a process owner, we will take ownership of activities without taking the responsibilities of owning a process, right? We will take, okay, I want, this person to make sure that we have a schedule for when we need to get budgets ready and blah, blah, blah. However, this group is not a finance group. what you would think money goes into finance. So you're going to just sit there and wait, and you're going to wait until finance decides to intervene, whenever, and they're going to come back and say, okay, you guys have 2 weeks, you guys have 1 week to get all of your budgets, etc. Like, there needs to be some awareness of these other activities that are happening that will directly impact your work and the work that you're doing that impacts others. And if there are processes that are internal to your function, your stability, a factor of that stability is how well you can manage your process, how your people are managing, how they're owning those processes so that they can communicate them the right way. And then to your point, it's important for us to understand when we create a work instruction, a walkthrough, a video, that's version 1. That is version 1. Because you are more than likely creating a process or updating a process based on some discussions that happened, some pain points that happened that are probably not yours, where leadership is quick to say, we don't like this because of this and that and the other. People that are on the ground level will find that workaround so that they can just produce whatever they need to produce. That's a conflict. That's friction. That will continue to disrupt the goal of consistency in your operations, which becomes a risk.
Yeah,
Misalignment.
for sure. And you're describing again the flow of information, right? I think another kind of very simple example is that I think these process owners imagine they're the people that really own the roadways for how these companies like navigate certain things as far as getting stuff done. The people that built the roads don't drive it every day, and if there's a couple of potholes and people are just driving around them and nobody finds out about them, they're just going to get bigger. They don't improve themselves, right? And it's like you have to tell somebody that these things are happening, and then the person who owns the process, you got to go about filling those potholes or making it drivable so that people can navigate this thing. You can't just ignore it and go, yeah, I built this thing, and then you take all the credit for this thing being built, and then you don't take any of the blame for this thing not working, right? It's like a weird thing that people will stick their heads out for that, but then when things go wrong, they like, oh yeah, that's not me, that's just so you're just driving incorrectly. And I don't know what you're talking about.
It's like too much effort. I mean, I lived in Boston. There's rats out there, there's mice out there, they end up in your house sometimes. Imagine living in a rental and you see one of these guys in your kitchen and you just go, and you decide to move out. You never tell the landlord, you never tell your roommates, like, that's what we're doing. We're finding issues, and not everything is this monumental issue. I will say that there's a number of things that have come my way. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this disappeared from whatever space. And all it was like somebody moved a column header, something like that, which means they were unclear about the guidelines of working in that space. So what does that mean? That means that person needs a little bit of a refresher. And we fail to continue the follow-up. And that's where these sort of issues just continue to be exasperated. So if I'm going to say anything, it's how do you fix it? Number 1, say something to somebody. Don't let these things that are broken in your internal systems just disappear. Say something, bring it into light, and connect the pain that is being caused by this process being broken, by this workflow, this cross-functional workflow not really working out. Address things with the right stakeholders. The 5 to 10 minutes that you spend in doing that, over the course of like, a week or two or something, a quick conversation here, a quick conversation there, you're going to find people that are going to want to help support the new fix. And it may not be one that needs 50, 60 people involved. It might just be one that needs like 2 or 3 to say, hey, I noticed this. Is that a problem? Yeah, I noticed that too. How often do you hear that? Yeah, I noticed that too. Why didn't anybody say anything about it? Why?
Right.
And then we want to complain about things. You have to speak up. You have to point out things, even internally. Hey, this is broken, guys. What do we got to do to fix that? Don't take it on to yourself. What do we? We are a team. Somebody might have bandwidth. Maybe somebody's new and knows that system and they haven't started a project yet. Hey, this is great. Can you take 2 weeks to work on this and fix this up before you start your other work? Maybe, yeah. We have to provide the opportunity to be successful in things like this. And when we're not, when we're just walking around and saying that, yeah, we have SOPs, but they're not really updated, and we're just glossing over that, your onboarding becomes slow. Your ability to carry knowledge starts to dissipate because now you're starting to create this tribal knowledge of like, who knows what, who knows the real process. Your source of truth is probably riddled with holes that you can't see. It should not be weeks for somebody to say, you know what? I didn't get any kind of notifications like I thought I would. And there's like 35 entries. It should have been like the second day of like, yeah, I looked in there and I saw the workflow worked, but I didn't get notified. Okay, there's a mistake there. Let's fix that now. Making sure that we really outline what these processes are supposed to do, these workflows are supposed to look like. We need to give that time to let it go into the field, let that workflow happen, and be prepared to take in a number of changes and separate those ones that are personal preference versus potholes in your road to success.
Yeah, I was going to say as I think it's pretty clear that if companies or teams are in a situation that they recognize that there are workflow misalignments within their operations, there are a number of things that you can do. Even the issues that you have with the workflow misalignment, they can take different shapes and forms depending on how they're connected with how many teams does this impact, how frequently are you using this workflow. And so I want to kind of lead this conversation into the assessment that you've developed for operational workflow alignment. So let's kind of talk about what are those risk factors that you would look at in evaluating something along the lines of, we've identified the workflow itself, but we're not really sure about how to go about evaluating what we need to focus on within the workflow, because there's different pieces to the workflow. It might have to do with onboarding. It might have to do with handoffs to another team. It might be people just don't even know that the workflow is visible, right? There's certain metrics that you use to evaluate it. And I think, to your earlier point, you can't see some of these workflow problems by just reading a document. You have to see them by observing how people work in them. And so that's really important too. How often are people submitting suggestions on how to improve it? There's all these like nuances to evaluating it. So what would you say is the typical way for companies to go about addressing this? And then let's talk about the assessment that you've developed for that and how it's different.
So my experience in sort of solving these challenges and solving these problems has been usually some level of heroics, and that is
shocking.
Some factor of, I've been blessed with working with direct senior executives, but usually there's some frustration that comes out. And in my past, I've had, Oscar, this is a disaster. Every time we go to talk about this, bullet point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we try to get 1, 2, 3, and we're unable to because 4, 5, 6. Can you work with that team and figure out how to approach it? So of course I go in there and I'm just like, what are we doing? What's the big deal? And usually it goes, well, they want X. One of the things that I try to really empower people with is letting them know that when you become the process owner, you own the process. You are able to say, that is not possible. However, we can do X. I can't give you metrics like this, but I can deliver this, because not every system is going to be the same. Not every process is going to give you all the metrics that you desire. So I think what we need to also understand is that leadership likes to point these things out, and it's because they have a certain expectation of my baseline of understanding in order for me to make this next decision. And if we can't provide that to them, they will come back and say, I don't really understand what's happening. That's a failure for us to understand what is really required from leadership. And in the way of when those things are, granted to leadership and they change their approach, that might happen. But you also have room to sort of push back and say, these are the things that we aligned on. Are you saying that you want these metrics now instead? We'll have to go back and adjust how we do these things so that we can provide you the right metrics that you're looking for. And that is the kind of conversation, not they changed their mind again. Now we have to redo the whole thing. Have the conversation, first before you start making any kind of changes. So that's usually what ends up happening. It's this one-off. Let's create the fix. Let's do the patchwork. And these usually what they're struggling with is visibility. So one of these risk factors in the operational workflow alignment assessment is this notion of milestone visibility, where really leadership is not able to see real-time views without having a formal meetings. Perhaps your milestones or the things that you're delivering are only identified by you guys. And this was another thing that we talked about, where you're creating what you think they want to see, as opposed to going to them and asking. And if they are not able to give you a strong answer, start to ask questions, create the dialogue. So what I'm hearing is, and this is a great therapy conversation, what I'm hearing is X. So this is what we can do, as opposed to taking word for word verbatim what a leader wants and then saying, okay, we're going to just deliver that to them, because they don't understand your process. They don't understand your workflow. They are going based off of their recognition of the type of work you're doing, but they don't really have the full transparency of the nitty-gritty details, and then how effective are you at predicting those things? So if you're consistently showing milestones, I had one issue where we were consistently showing milestones where we were hitting like 95% of our enrollment goals. But the problem was you're not adding 95% month over month. It's actually with percentages and statistics, you have to multiply them. So after 6 months, we were not 95% to our goal. We were much less than that. And it was sort of a oopsie. We were creating this view of how we were doing monthly, but when you compounded month over month, we were getting further and further and further away from our ending point of the clinical trial. And I'm sure, as you know, another month on a clinical trial can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Easy, especially in a global trial, you can probably hit into the millions. So our assessment looks at 5 major spaces, your workflow hands-off, 5 major friction points, that these are these risk factors. The workflow handoffs, is there clear ownership? Do we know at the end of this process, of this part of the process? You said it yourself. Things start in the very beginning and they slowly roll up, right? So as we go from one function to the next, to the next, to the next, is it clear who does what? Is it clear when done is done for this group and it becomes the start for the next group? Duplication and reworks. Are you having to rework any of the data that you're doing, or recreating or re-entering deliverables because they were inaccessible or they were in the wrong format, or the timeline, the resolution is different across your programs? Are you understanding what those root causes are of those duplication points? Can be related to the system, can be related to the ownership, to clarity. And you lose time. You lose time just redoing things and just fine tuning. And you find yourself, and this is, I think, where you get those, when you get those scientists and other folks that are just saying, yeah, I create PowerPoint slides, because it's this constant like finessing of a message, when the message should be pretty clear if we're developing our workflows to provide responses to these types of questions. And then we talked about it before, clarity. And the one that we didn't really talk about was tool fragmentation. So, are our outputs connected, or even are they able to be connected? Are we what tools are we using internally that provides the various components to create this full project level view, this full view of our operations here in this section of the facilities, or in this part of R&D, in this research project. Are they providing support together? Are they matching up? If I get data from this system and data from this system, can I put them together on top of the project timeline? If the answer is no, your tools are fragmented, your data is fragmented. And these start to create silos and forces that reconciliation work, forces the rework. Why? Because you can't find anything. You can't find anything. I have no idea how somebody listed a folder. I don't know how they listed and then what you'll hear, we sent that to you guys. I'm sorry. I have to say this. Sending a message on Slack and saying, here it is for something that is critically important to your operations. And then 3 months later saying, oh yeah, I sent it. No one knows where that is. This needs to be curated into a repository of sorts, and something, again, that is the documentation of your system. And as it grows, it demands for you to groom the system, to reconcile, to archive things that are not relevant anymore. Why do I care about the things that happened in Q1 of 2024? I don't even want to see them. Put them into a folder, put them away. If somebody asks for it, we can find it in the archives. But in terms of what is visible to me right now, it's 2026. I don't need to see that stuff. Why do I even see it? There's a lot of work there.
I find that, even just looking at the different risk factors, I think this assessment, and even the one that we talked about last week about 1.1, it's very qualitative focused and not so much quantitative, right? So you're not asking for like, what are the numbers behind this or that? It's really about how people are experiencing these workflows as they work through them day to day, and how they experience these pain points. And I think that's something that people should take away is it's just because it says it's green doesn't actually mean that it's green for everybody working in it. And I think it's
don't turn it to red,
right? Don't
turn it to red. I've seen discussion after discussion of, if you're about to turn it red, you need to have a whole team. Like, holy cow, we agreed on the guidelines of what is green, what is yellow, what is red. It's qualitative. The perception of the color red is like smallpox. I mean, people want to avoid it so much, even if you say the intent for the red is to gain the attention of leadership, that we require support. And that safety also has to be there from leadership, that this is a cry for help, not we're going to lose everything we play. Oh no, it's the end of the world. That's not what we're doing here. Let's get out of those egos. Let's get out of that fear. Let's create a system that if you actually want to be, as many people say, as many organizations say, the best company of X of this place, in the greater Boston area, in New England, in California, in the world, in Europe, you have to be able to accept when there are challenges, when there are issues, when there are changes that need to happen, and carry those through and carry people with you. In order for those workflows to continue to thrive, it needs to fundamentally become part of the culture to manage those processes, to look at how you're combining your tools, to creating the visibility, and then comes the behavior part. And that's a challenge where it does need to come a combination from the top down and also throughout the middle layer of making sure to say, hey, we are now being held accountable. If these things are exceeding our capacity, that is what we need to discuss. But it's just so easy for people to, as soon as they get busy, to drop things like this, to drop how you're designing your workflows in your organization. And I think they can be hard to describe. They can be hard to pinpoint and to understand. So our assessment 2.1 does just that. It asks a lot of sort of specific, but also qualitative. So it's not, I wouldn't call them general questions. They're very specific. to how your operations work. The teams, we ask about the teams that you're working with. We ask about your outputs from different systems as it relates to your challenges, to your operations. These are the fundamental pieces that we find to be critical to having solid operations that are resilient to change and allow you to grow and to scale.
Stop those band-aids.
Everywhere, man, everywhere. So I think that's all we have for today on this topic. I'm so glad we got to talk about it. I think these are issues that are top of mind, and your priorities are going to change. Your leadership structure is probably going to change, which means the way that you do things day to day today is not going to be the same way that you're doing things in 2 or 3 years. Change is inevitable. So part of maintaining this is also maintaining the notion that change is going to happen. And once these things are developed and created and curated, you still need to have some system to monitor when the changes need to happen in those workflows. 2.1 does that. 2.1 will find where you are hurting the most. And working with us will help you understand what's the path forward to fix it. So if you have any questions, if you want to take a look, we have our assessments online now, sigmalabconsulting.com. Take a look for yourself, see the different assessments that we have available, and we'll be happy to work through a lot of the challenges that you're facing today and maybe some that you see coming down the pipeline, and really design solutions so that you can grow and your teams can grow, and you're not just being busy, you're being productive. And you're finding efficiency and lowering that operational risk. Lawrence, thanks for your time, buddy.
Yeah. See you on the next one.